So my name's Ben Allen. I'm a wildlife researcher from University of Southern Queensland in Australia. And I'm here now in South Africa attending the conference for the South African Wildlife Management Association. One of the hats that I wear in my role is the International Partnerships or Relationships Officer, responsible for maintaining our interaction with SAWMA and the sister association in Australia, which is the Australasian Wildlife Management Association. So I have the lucky task of being able to keep up international relations between the two organisations and at times get to come to South Africa. In my job as a wildlife researcher at USQ, I do full-time wildlife research on whatever I want. So I have one of the blessed positions of being able to study predators and prey, and reptiles and birds and mammals all over Australia, Southeast Asia and other countries, and get to supervise honours, masters and PhD students doing the same thing. My background and my main interest, where I cut my teeth, is in predation management in predator-prey systems. And this could be things like trying to manage the impacts of wild dogs or dingoes on sheep and cattle, or trying to manage the predation impacts of a whole raft of predators in southern Africa and the prey that they eat. So that's my sort of bread and butter, but as a wildlife researcher, you just become interested in so many things and you end up studying all sorts of stuff. I first got involved in work in South Africa when I was contacted by Professor Graham Curley from Nelson Mandela University, who was running a big nationwide study on predation management in South Africa. It had multiple institutions, 20, 30, 40 odd experts from South Africa reviewing all of the work done on all of the predators versus all of the prey, particularly around livestock predation in the country. And I was brought onto the project as an international reviewer for the work that had been done. I found it very valuable to, in the process of reviewing their work, to just learn how much stuff is happening on the other side of the world and to take back some of the lessons and apply them in our own context. So I found that some of our experiences in Australia are unique. We do some things really, really well, and South Africa doesn't necessarily do those things well. So I was able to share my experience with the predation management researchers in South Africa, but equally the other way, there's a whole bunch of things that are occurring in Southern Africa, problems that we don't have in Australia, and the solutions that are offered in South Africa can be really useful for Australia. So I found it very valuable to both share and receive that knowledge and broaden my experience in that field of predation management.
My name is Victoria Inman. I did my PhD in Botswana looking at hippo populations. That was a few years ago. Now I'm back in Australia working for the state government doing koala research. So I'm here at the SAWMA conference talking about my PhD research. So I was talking about the temporal and spatial patterns of hippos in the Okavango Delta, looking at if their populations were increasing or decreasing and what was driving that. So I've come over as a representative of the Australasian Wildlife Management Society. I got a travel grant to come here. It's so nice to come back to Southern Africa. I actually hadn't been to South Africa before, even though Botswana is so close. It's very different here, which has been very eye-opening. A lot of the animals are obviously the same, but all of the management techniques are so different because Botswana, almost no fences, whereas here, everywhere we go, it's all about land management in fenced areas. So I've actually probably learnt more about African conservation than I thought I was going to. And it's so nice to come here and present to people about hippos, people that actually work with hippos. When I present my research in Australia, I think everyone thinks it's very cool and are interested in it, but it's probably not that applicable to them and it's a bit of a novelty, whereas here people have actually come up to me and sort of told me a bit more about hippo management in their areas, and it's been really nice to talk to them. It's interesting transferring my research or my research techniques, I suppose, from hippos in Botswana, and now I'm in Australia working on koalas, obviously extremely different animals. Koalas can be weirdly vicious, so people think they're soft and cuddly, but I'm probably more scared of koalas than hippos, honestly. You'd be surprised at how much overlap there is. So an issue I had in Botswana and an issue a lot of people have researching hippos is how do you track them, hard to put a collar on. Kind of, you can put anklets, but they're not great. And we have very similar issues in koalas back in Australia. We still don't have a very good way. You put collars on them, they're not great, ear tags fall off. And it's the same, I used a lot of drones in my research with hippos, and now I've been using drones to count koalas as well. So it's actually weirdly applicable. I think having worked in other countries and then coming back to Australia, it's been hugely valuable for my work in Australia. My old boss straight out told me I only got the job because I had worked in Africa, and she knew that if I could sort of cope with that, I could probably cope with organising the logistics within Australia. It's a lot easier. So I think there's been, you learn a lot of problem solving and independent research, and sort of trying to figure out solutions when you work somewhere quite remotely like I did in the Okavango Delta. And now to come back to Australia, I can apply those skills, and it's often a lot easier than it had been before. A particular example of how valuable it's been for me to come to this conference is I actually had someone approach me after my talk. They're a farmer, they're a land manager, and a couple of years ago they introduced hippos onto their property. They're trying to start a population there where they used to be a couple of hundred years ago and were exterminated. And he was asking my advice about how to manage them, and it was really nice to feel like I had some valuable information for someone about how to bring hippos back to an area.
My name's Nikki Anderson. I'm from Adelaide, South Australia. I work for Zoos South Australia and am an adjunct lecturer at Flinders University. I've had a significant interest in conservation from a very young age, but I think African animals in particular has been something that has developed over time. I remember going to the zoo as a young child and actually seeing hippos in the front gate and thinking they were amazing, and how big the giraffes were and how big the rhinos were. I guess that sort of transferred into an alternative interest into carnivores and the issues that arise with their conservation and conflict with humans. As part of my PhD, I focused on African wild dogs. The topic of interest was disease efficacy, and I did a vaccination trial for canine parvovirus. I also looked at how stressed they got during capture. So as part of my PhD, I worked with the African wild dogs on a frequent basis, and it was really interesting to see the interactions that each and every one of them had with each other. Given that they're an animal in captivity, what happens there is in some ways artificial, and it sparked my interest to want to travel and see them in their natural environment. So over the last 7 years, I've been to Africa 3 times. I've visited different projects, predominantly in Zambia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and more recently in Namibia, and focusing particularly on carnivores and African wild dogs. So coming to SAWMA, I've really valued meeting people who have worked directly with wildlife and understanding better the situation and conditions that African wildlife have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. More importantly, I've valued the connections that I've made and the relationships, future relationships that I'm building with members of SAWMA, and the collaborative projects that I hope to do into the future. So one of the reasons why I have joined AWMS as well as SAWMA is because I really value the integrated approach that ex situ and in situ conservation have, which is reflected in the one plan approach.
Hello, I'm Eliane McCarthy, and I am a former master's student from Western Sydney University, and now I'm a PhD student with the University of Sydney. For my master's, I studied Australia's flying fox population and monitoring them using drone technology. And for my PhD, I'm monitoring the effects of a wide-scale cull in Australia's alpine landscape. I'm in South Africa because the Australasian Wildlife Management Society and SAWMA collaborated on creating this wonderful opportunity for 2 Australians, former students or researchers in Australia, to come over to South Africa and present at the SAWMA conference in 2022. and present on our research either in Australia, in my case, or in Victoria's case, on hippos in Botswana. My first impressions arriving in Africa is that the wildlife is just screaming at you all the time, and it's everywhere, and it's so incredibly diverse. In Australia, I feel like we're so set on conserving the small amount of wild spaces we have left, and our national parks are so heavily managed. But here, it seems like everything's so in abundance and alive. It's so alive here. I think the most standout things that I've realised from the SAWMA talks is that there's a different perspective or different perspectives when looking at human-wildlife conflict in South Africa. In Australia, perhaps we don't talk enough about how humans interact with wildlife, but here, because perhaps the animals are really charismatic and a lot physically larger, it's something that's very openly discussed, and there's so many different perspectives, and we heard so many lively conversations about different ways that humans can interact with wildlife, from all different perspectives, and that was fascinating. One lesson that I've learnt while I'm here is to have a more open approach to discussing culling and control and killing of animals, because in my PhD research, I'm researching the effects of a wide-scale cull on species assemblages in alpine Australia. And we've been told always to downplay talking about culling animals and talking about control, and refer to it, not as culling or control, but as, to skirt around what is actually going on. But I think here everyone's very matter-of-fact about what's going on, and I like that it seems like the conversations are very honest and open, which is great. Today I presented on using thermal drones to monitor flying foxes across southeastern Australia and on Christmas Island. And after the talk, someone came up to me who was a reserve manager, and he'd recently just bought this very expensive piece of drone technology, and he was trying to convince the funders who'd purchased the drone for him for the reserve, that it was a worthwhile piece of equipment. And he told me this really amazing story about how he'd been able to use it to shepherd rhinoceros out of the fence line of a reserve and to get them to move towards the centre of the reserve. And I thought that was just an incredible use of drone technology. But he told me after my talk he'd realised that he could build these orthomosaics or photo maps, which was what I did with my research, to map out different areas of the reserves and to more precisely monitor changes in sand dune dynamics and different vegetation types. And he said, is making an orthomosaic or this big photo map going to be very hard because I don't have much programming background? And I was able to tell him that it's actually quite easy, and we talked about how to do it, and it was really nice to be able to show someone that the method that I presented could be applied in different circumstances and was not something that was prohibited by funds or computing skills or anything like that.
If you're interested in wildlife or interested in the management of wildlife, I would really encourage you to get involved in SAWMA or AWMS or both, and really get stuck into it, because there's so much to learn from the people that are researching, studying or managing these species, both here and abroad, that you really need to think big and get out there and just do it.